My name is Frank Dirks, and I'm with Carolina Catholic Professionals, and we're delighted to have tonight with us Joseph Pearce. He is with us for the first of two nights to discuss two books: his autobiography, Race with the Devil, and his biography of Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
The talk of 25 minutes or so, and then some Q&A with Frank, if he wants to clarify anything or ask something that perhaps I didn't make clear, and then a second talk of about the same length, and then concluding questions, clarifications, and then Frank will bring things to an end again. So I'm going to begin with giving my own conversion story, my own testimony, if you like, which was told at greater length in a book I wrote called Race with the Devil: My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. Now, because of my background in extremist white supremacist politics, when I presented myself to be received into the church after obviously breaking away from that dark and violent past, the priest who was instructing me asked me to write a paper. Now, I don't know if any of you are converts, but I do know that none of you were asked to write a paper when you were part of the process of being received into the church. The reason the priest asked me that was because he knew that in my past life, I had been a writer. I'd edited two magazines. For one of those magazines, I was actually sent to prison twice. So he thought, for me at least, well, if you're a writer, tell me why with the written word. So then I found myself in the situation that we all have. In the old days, for people as old as I am, you'd be staring at a blank page. These days, you're staring at a blank screen, but it's the same thing. The worst part about writing anything, whether it's an article, a book, a paper, is getting that first sentence down. So here I am staring at the blank page, wondering how do I even begin to explain where I've been and why I find myself on the threshold of entering the church. And as I was thinking that, some words of a very famous hymn, which we all know, which I'm not going to sing, entered my mind, and this became the epigraph for my paper that I put down in writing to get me going. And the lines are: Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Now, apart from the fact that I was blinded by my own pride and prejudice, another very appropriate thing about that hymn is it was written by John Newton, who was a former slave owner. So, for someone who's a former white supremacist racist, the whole thing seemed to come together. These lines from that hymn: Amazing grace that saved a wretch like me. So let's take the whole thing back to my childhood. And I was raised as a racist by my father, who actually was a very good father in many other ways, very loving. He taught me many good things, but he had a knee-jerk racist view of things. And he was also very anti-Catholic. So his term of abuse for Catholics was bead rattlers. And one night, when he came home from the pub, my mother had in the bedroom my grandmother's rosary beads, because my grandmother was an Irish Catholic, my mum's mum. But my mum wasn't raised Catholic. My mum would not know how to say the rosary. She would not care how to say the rosary. But she kept them just as a memento, as a token of her love for her mother. My dad came home from the pub and said, "We're not having those papist beads in the house." And he threw them out the window. So I was raised as being anti-black and anti-Catholic. And then I went to a school, which was a very bad school. And actually, I always knew I had a bad education, but there's some recent statistics bear me out, because the part of the East End of London in which I was raised, in a recent survey within the last 15 years or so, found that the educational district where my school was the worst in the whole country, and that my particular school, Eastbury Comprehensive, was the worst school in that educational district. So I actually have a claim that I did go to the worst school in England, with statistics to back it up. Now, the motto of that school, emblazoned in great big letters behind the stage in the auditorium where we gathered every morning at school, were the words, "This above all to thine own self be true." William Shakespeare. Now, my father taught me that there are only three types of people in the world. There were Englishmen. There are those who would like to be Englishmen. And there are those who don't know any better. Now, we weren't a religious family, but for my father, the greatest Englishman who ever lived was William Shakespeare. So in a household without God, if you like, that worshipped our own nation, England, William Shakespeare, the greatest Englishman ever lived, that's the nearest I got, really, to God. So this above all to thine own self be true, William Shakespeare. But I'm going to take that as my own personal motto, as long as I'm true to myself. But what I didn't realize, my school being ignorant, presumably didn't realize either, that those words weren't actually written. Sorry, those words weren't actually said by William Shakespeare. They were written by him, which is not the same thing. The words were said by Polonius, who's a character in Hamlet, who is a knave, a liar, and an outright villain. And they're given in the speech that Polonius gives to his son, Laertes. Laertes is about to go off to college in Paris. And so Polonius thinks this is the right time to give him a pep talk, giving him his precepts for the meaning of life. And that whole speech, one of the most famous in all of Shakespeare's plays, there's no mention of virtue. There's no mention of God. There's no mention of loving your neighbor. There's certainly no mention of holiness. It's all pragmatism. Make the right friends, those that will advance you. Wear the right clothes. Don't borrow money. Don't lend money. All this sort of practical advice about how to get on in the world in a purely practical sense. And this above all to thine own self be true. In other words, ultimately, the only truth is yourself. It's relativism. And throughout the course of that play, Polonius, who's a villain, by following those relativistic precepts, gets himself killed. His son, Laertes, by following those relativistic precepts, gets himself killed. And Ophelia, who loves Hamlet and is forced against her conscience to spy on him under the cover of holiness, posing as reading a prayer book when she's actually spying with her father and the king hiding, that destroys her conscience to such a degree that she basically goes mad and probably commits suicide. So we can see what Shakespeare's saying about that motto of my school. It's deadly. Relativism is deadly. It breeds and leads to the culture of death. So I'm following those precepts. And at the age of 15, I joined a white supremacist organization in England called the National Front. Now, from objective criteria, I can be condemned. But from the criteria of being true to myself, my truth is as good as your truth. Don't judge my truth. So from that perspective, who's to judge me, right? So I joined this white supremacist organization. And even worse than that, or as bad as that, I should say, my anti-Catholicism led me to become very involved with the terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland. So I was involved with the two Protestant terrorist organizations, the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, and the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. I was also a member of a Protestant secret society, which only existed to hate Catholics, called the Orange Order. So I was a long way from the Catholic Church. I should say, by the way, that no, I won't say, because I don't have time to say everything I want to say. I was also very heavily involved in the skinhead movement. I founded a punk rock record label called White Noise Records, which was an appropriate name for the record label because it was white and it was noise. And our first single was by a band called Screwdriver, S and K, Screwdriver with a K, SK as in skinhead. And the first single was called White Power, and I was guest vocalist on that song, and my lines were White Power, and that was it in the chorus. And then the B-side, those of you that are old enough to know what B-sides are. The B-side was another track called Smash the IRA. Again, if you're old enough, you know what the IRA is, and if you don't, I'm not giving footnotes. But my part of those in that song as guest vocalist was Smash, Smash. So after all these years, and it's many years now, God knows how many years, 35 years or more, I still remember the words and I still remember the tune. Yeah, smash, smash, one word twice and no tune. Not that difficult to remember. I was also very involved with the neo-fascist organizations on the continent in Europe, particularly a group from Italy called Terza Posizione, which means third position. And they were alleged to be responsible for the planting of a bomb at Bologna railway station, which killed over 100 people. They escaped from Italy, made their way across Europe, and we put them up in safe houses in England. I became friends with the leaders of that organization. Were they responsible for that bombing? I actually don't think so, but I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because I didn't ask. Because if you're involved in any way with terrorism, and saying I was involved with the terrorist organization in Northern Ireland, I'm involved with this alleged terrorist organization from Italy, you live by the don't ask, don't know principle, right? Because if you don't ask, you don't know. And if you don't know, you're safe. Once you know, you're involved. So you just don't ask. For your own protection, also for the protection of the terrorists, right? The fewer people that know what they're doing, from their perspective, the better. And if that were not enough, I was also very anti-American, just in case you thought there might be something endearing about me at the time. We used to have demonstrations outside US air bases in England with Yanks Go Home placards, and our members would be in fights with members of the US Air Force in the local pubs around the air bases. So basically, you see, I'm basically full of negativity, right? I'm anti-Catholic, I'm anti-Black, I'm certainly anti-British government, I'm anti-American. And I went to prison twice for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred on my editorship of a magazine called Bulldog. And I first went to prison in 1982 when I was 20 years old. And I went to prison a second time in 1985 when I was 24 years old. But something happened in those 4 years in between, and this was what set in motion my conversion. So whereas when I was sent to prison the first time, I considered myself to be a political soldier, a revolutionary, a political prisoner, and I screamed at the judge as they dragged me off to the cells that he would face his own judgment come the day. Second prison sentence was much more difficult for me. I a 6-month sentence the first time, a 12-month sentence the second time. Second one was much more difficult because by the time I got to that second sentence, I didn't even know that I believed in the stuff. I was going through the motions because my beliefs in white supremacism and anti-Catholicism had been undermined by other reading, which I'll get to in just a moment. So at the beginning of that second prison sentence, on the second day of that second prison sentence, in fact, December 1985, I remember holding in my hands some rosary beads. Now, of course, I know what rosary beads were. My father called Catholics bead rattlers. As I said, he threw my grandmother's rosary beads out of the window. And in Northern Ireland, in the anti-Catholic terrorist circles I was moving in Northern Ireland, they had a song which ironically goes to the tune of Home on the Range, and it goes like this: No, no Pope of Rome, no chapels to sadden my eyes, no nuns and no priests, no rosary beads. Every day is the 12th of July. 12th of July is a feast day in Northern Ireland where the Protestants celebrate a victory over the Catholics 300 years ago plus. So I knew what rosary beads were, but now I'm holding these rosary beads in my hand, and I don't want to throw them out the window of my cell. What I want to do is pray. I've never prayed in my life. And now I want to, and don't really know how to. And I certainly can't pray the rosary because I didn't know the Apostles' Creed. I didn't know the Hail Mary. I didn't know the Glory Be. I certainly didn't know the mysteries. And even the Our Father, which I had been taught when I was very small, I have since forgotten. But what I did do was to mumble inarticulate prayers and fumble the beads. And that opened the floodgates. In other words, it opened the conversation. I asked for help. Help started flooding in. Healing, a great desire for reception into the church. I started to go to Mass during that prison sentence. I read all sorts of works of Catholic apologetics. So why that change in those 4 years? It was because I started to read, in the first instance, G.K. Chesterton. And you might wonder, well, why would a rabidly anti-Catholic neo-Nazi be interested in reading Chesterton? Well, I wasn't interested in religion. I certainly wasn't interested in Christianity, and I despised Catholicism. So I would never have picked up a Chesterton book if it was about Catholicism. So I thought. But I was interested in politics, and we would have violent confrontations on the streets with the Marxists, and they would taunt our side with, you are just the stormtroopers of capitalism. In other words, you're just doing the job of the bosses. And my attitude was, look, I might be anti-communist, but it doesn't mean I want the world being run by Bill Gates and the International Monetary Fund. I mean, there was no Bill Gates then. There was an International Monetary Fund, but there were global corporations and the IMF and the World Bank and all of that, what we now would call globalist entities. And I thought, you know, that I might be anti-communist, but that doesn't mean I want to support those people. So I was interested in other ideas. And someone said, well, have you looked at the distributist ideas of G.K. Chesterton? And I said, well, who is G.K. Chesterton? So they said, well, you need to read this one essay, particularly by Chesterton. It's called Reflections on a Rotten Apple, which is about politics and economics. But it was 2/3 of the way through a book called The Well and the Shallows. So I bought the book. And I thought, if this fellow Chesterton is that highly regarded and he's got the right political ideas, I'm not going to go straight to that essay. You know, if he's worth reading, he's worth reading. I started reading from page 1. And the rest of that book is a defense of the Catholic Church. The title of the book, The Well and the Shallows. It's one of the last books Chesterton wrote. The well is the Catholic Church. It has depth. It has profundity. It has life-giving waters against the shallows, which is everything else. And so the various essays basically taking up that theme. And I'm not saying I agreed with everything. I didn't. But what it did do was undermine my anti-Catholicism, certainly undermine my understanding of Catholics not being rational, not having an argument for their beliefs. And I couldn't help liking Chesterton. My response to Chesterton actually was exactly the same as C.S. Lewis's. When C.S. Lewis first read Chesterton during World War I, when he was in the British Army, he was an atheist. But in spite of that, he said he couldn't help liking Chesterton. He said it's a bit like falling in love, that you actually like the other person for their goodness, even if you don't agree with them. And I realized what it was. Chesterton was a good man, good-hearted, good-natured, good sense of humor, with a good mind, and pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful, and introducing me to concepts such as the good, the true, and the beautiful. So I started buying everything by Chesterton I could get my hands on. In those days, you could do that cheaply in second-hand bookshops. And then through Chesterton, one day I was looking through a second-hand bookshop in London, and came across a book by someone called C.S. Lewis. Now, I'd heard of Lewis, but I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know he was Christian. I think probably what I knew was he wrote a children's book called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I didn't even know, I'd never read that, had even no idea that was Christian. But something prompted me to take the book off the shelf. And I opened the book at random, and the first thing I saw was the name Chesterton. So now I'm interested. Whoever this person C.S. Lewis is, he's talking about Chesterton. And I read that account I've just given of his first reading Chesterton. He's an atheist, and I'm an agnostic. And I'm reading Lewis and think, yeah, he's exactly like me. Lewis is exactly like me. He likes Chesterton in spite of Chesterton's Catholicism. In fact, Lewis says Chesterton has more common sense than all the moderns put together, except, of course, his Christianity. And I said, yes, that's exactly right. So I bought the book by C.S. Lewis. That book is Surprised by Joy, and it's C.S. Lewis's conversion story. So here I am, sort of being hooked in again. I'm reading it, I'm fascinated. I thought he's not going to convert us in, he does. And okay, let's go with it. And I fell in love with C.S. Lewis and Hilaire Belloc. I would also say, by the way, that John Paul II's, St. John Paul II's now, stand against communism in Poland with the Solidarity trade union movement. I admired John Paul's courage. I admired his anti-Catholicism. So my anti-papist views are being undermined. So that's the situation. When I go to prison second time, where I have this great desire to pray. When I start praying, answers start pouring forth. So then I have to break from my past. You have to understand that within the National Front, within the movement, I was a hero, right? I'm a martyr. I've been to prison twice. During the first prison sentence, particularly, I received something like 10,000 birthday cards. It was impossible to drive more than 30 miles on any freeway in England without Free Joe Pearce graffiti on the overpasses. So I was a hero, a martyr. But outside the movement, I was a pariah. My prison sentences made front-page headlines. So that one of the reasons I was still involved for the second prison sentence and going through the motions is, what else am I going to do? But now when I got out of prison, I knew how to make a clean break, which meant leaving all my friends, deliberately moved to a backwater area of England, an agricultural part of England, started a new life. And then when I wrote my first book, I thought nobody is going to publish a book with my name on it. So I have to use a nom de plume. And so I decided to use the name Robert Williamson as my pseudonym. The reason for that was there's another Loyalist song, which we used to sing, called The Old Orange Flute. And if you'll forgive me, I'll sing it to you because you need to get the context for Robert Williamson as the name I chose. In the county Tyrone near the town of Dungannon, where many's a ruction, myself had a Hannon. Bob Williamson lived there, a weaver by trade, and all of us thought him a stout orange blade. But the cunning young Coo-boy sure took us all in, and he married a papist called Bridget McGinn, turned papist himself, and forsook the old cause that gave us our freedom, religion, and laws. Now the boys of the town, they made some noise upon it, and Bob had to fly to the province of Connaught. And so it goes on. But I thought, that's me. I am Robert Williamson. I am Bob Williamson. I'm not a weaver, but I am a former member of the Orange Order who's become a Catholic. It doesn't happen very often, right? People in the Orange Order are so anti-Catholic, they're not likely to become Catholics. So I'm unusual, but I associated with Robert Williamson, Bob Williamson. But it doesn't, I wasn't married to a papist, but I think that God has a great sense of humor. In fact, I know he does. I could give you theological reasons, such as, for instance, that the animals don't laugh. Only those made in God's image laugh, right? We have reason, we have the ability to love, all of which are things that come from God. God is love, God is reason, but clearly laughter is part of it. As Hilaire Belloc said, wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there's always laughter and good red wine. At least I've always found it so. Benedicamus Domino. So there's something, the joie de vivre, right? The joie de foi, right? The joy of faith in being a Catholic. So I think God has a sense of humor. That's where we get it from. But anyway, I think he liked this Bob Williamson thing because, I said, okay, it works so far, former Orange man, but I'm not married to a papist called Bridget McGinn. Then I meet a lady in Oxford, and she's from not from the county Tyrone, near the town of Dungannon. She's from Southern California, Orange County. So the connection is not really happening, is it, at the moment? Anyway, we fall in love and we get married, and eventually I meet her mother-in-law. So my mother-in-law, her mother, who is from the county Tyrone, near the town of Dungannon. She's actually from a small village called the Rock, just outside Dungannon in County Tyrone, Northern Ireland. Now, what's the chances of that? I mean, it's millions to one. Now, I'm going to call myself Bob Williamson and then marry Bridget McGinn's daughter. I mean, it's not going to happen. It did happen. So we moved to the States, started a new life, and I just want to finish, because I want to keep this fairly brief and keep ourselves on schedule. Whenever I give this talk, if I forget to finish with the postscript about my father, I always feel very guilty. And my father was received into the Catholic Church about 10 years before he died, and spent the last 10 years of his life as a Catholic. And on his deathbed, I was living over here, and by the grace of God and by God's providence, I happened to be at a C.S. Lewis conference in Cambridge in England, only 65 miles from where my father was when he was rushed to hospital and died a few days later. So I was with him at his deathbed. And the last thing we did together, just a few hours before he died, was pray the rosary. And I would say that my first published book as a Catholic is my biography of Chesterton. And I always say that was an act of thanksgiving. It's an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton. But it was also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joseph. That is beautiful testimony to our Lord and God's saving grace. Your autobiography brings out a number of themes that I think that are worthy of exploring. One of them I thought that was really interesting was when you really talk about your kind of intellectual development and increasing appreciation of Catholicism and the concepts of the faith. One of the paths that you took to get there is you were taking a look at and in fact there was a passage where you really talked about there in looking at Orwell and this concept of progress that was encapsulated in the state, which was embraced by Marxism, but more broadly kind of progressivism, that the state is this inexorable force. And you kind of described Orwell as putting out his hand and saying, stop, that is going to be ultimately destructive and ultimately deadly. But you recognize that Orwell didn't really have any alternative to that. I mean, he was as much kind of a progressive as the advocates of the progressive state. And it almost was as if there was this void that you were looking to fill in some other way, which obviously you found in the church and in the faith. Did you develop that a little bit more?
Yeah, basically, it seemed to me that the world was obviously marching, goose-stepping, in fact, in the wrong direction. If you look at the 20th century, the rise of Marxism, the Soviet Union, communist China, other communist revolutions, the rise of the Nazis and the fascists. It was the age of the big government, big totalitarian state, and it was believed that this was inexorable because it was progress. In other words, that somehow or other history was a sort of mechanism, and this is coming the ideas of the philosopher Hegel as adopted and adapted by Karl Marx. The idea that history is this sort of mechanism which you can't do anything about. It's like a juggernaut, You either go with it or you're going to be crushed by it, but you can't stop it. And it seemed to me that that was not only evil, but it was wrong, because and again, reading Chesterton helped me with this. That ultimately, history is made by the actions of human persons acting freely, and because we're fallen and broken, we often act in an evil way. We allow pride to be our guide, and not humility, not virtue. That's why we're in the mess. But it's not because of any machine. That we can do nothing about this sort of inexorable god of progress. So I began to realize that that the Marxists were wrong, so were the Nazis, because the Nazis were following the same idea. Hitler was founding a 1,000-year Reich, and so basically this was the real Roman Empire, right? It was the German Empire, and Marx saying the same thing. Once you had the dictatorship of the proletariat, history would end, basically with a golden age in the future. And it seemed to me that that this idea of a golden age in the future was a load of nonsense. And it's more like, if you look at actually what these people had done, it was not a dream, but a nightmare.
Well, one of the ways too, I think that you get to that in your discussion, and this is really just kind of your intellectual discovery of this, rather than that discovery in the heart and that conversion in the heart. But when you talk about Belloc's and Chesterton's idea of distributism, and how that relates to Catholic subsidiarity, which itself gets us a little bit more, I think, to the personal, to the change of one soul at a time. Do you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, the thing is that basically the solution to the poison of big government is the health of small government. And that means local government. It also means the health of instead of having the whole of industry controlled by big government and nationalized, you want loads of small businesses. So a world of loads of small businesses in an environment of small government, in other words, local government and only power devolved from local government upwards, not imposed downwards from the center. So this was Chesterton's idea and Belloc's idea and E.F. Schumacher's idea in Small is Beautiful. Another book was very influential on me. But I realized, of course, part of my conversion process, that Belloc and Chesterton got those ideas from the papal encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII and Pope Pius XI. So when I began to realize that all of the political ideas, the political philosophy that I now adhere to and believed in was actually Catholic social teaching, it made me realize, look, whether I believe in God or not, the Catholic Church is a force for good in the world.
One of the counterpoints I think people have when we talk about the Hegelian determinism of the state and its in its inexorable growth is that a counterpoint to that, and we're seeing this today. It was certainly present in in Northern Ireland and Great Britain in the late 70s and early 80s. This almost tribalism among groups, and sure, there's this talk of ideology and means of trying to control the state, but it's really much more tribal, and the hatreds, it seemed like, were much more visceral rather than ideological.
Well, what I actually see now in the United States in 2020 gives me a great sense of deja vu, in a rather sickening sense, because it seems to me that the United States in 2020 looks an awful lot like the revolutionary society I grew up in the 1970s, where we lived in a radicalized culture where both sides hated each other and hated the government. It was something which was defined by hatred and violence and negativity and an absence of love. It's about hating your enemy, not loving your neighbor. And I see that same thing materializing today in the United States. And it makes me realize, and again, the more you understand history, that we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. It's because we don't listen to the words of the gospel. We don't live lives of virtue. We live lives of vice, and lives of vice leads to viciousness.
Well, one of the drivers for that, and a consistent theme in your story, is this idea of pride and the prison that pride creates for people. And certainly pride is at the root of that kind of, the atavistic hatred that we see today and that we see, throughout history. But it's a real personal pride that just entraps us in ourselves and, within our ego and all that. And, not only were you describing kind of a personal prison, but you were talking about that prison, the bonds of that pride keep you, chained in that prison. So how did, and you referenced these, obviously, how did Our Lady, how did, Father Yo, help loosen those chains and free you of that sinful pride?
Well, again, the way I define it is that love, which is only possible if we have humility. So humility enables love. Love is the sacrifice of ourselves for others. Pride is the sacrificing of others to ourselves. So insofar as society is based upon pride, you're going to have nothing but viciousness and destructiveness. But that's true on a microcosmic level with ourselves, all right? That we actually sacrifice other people to ourselves, and we don't become any happier because of it. We become more and more miserable. So what was necessary is always necessary to escape, which means you have to actually get outside your own ego, to get beyond the egocentrism to a healthy excentrism, looking for a center that's outside the self, ultimately, of course, God. But, meeting Father Richard Yo, who's a good holy Benedictine priest, who was the first priest I went to for instruction, enabled me to vent and voice and get things wrong. And with great love, he corrected me. And I fell in love with him. It's a bit like, falling in love with Chesterton, this was a good man, and I should really listen to the good man rather than shut my ears to him. And that was a major step in the right direction. And as regards the Blessed Virgin, I lived 30 miles from one of the major Marian shrines in Christendom, the Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham, which in the Middle Ages was the largest Marian shrine in Christendom. There was an apparition of the Blessed Virgin there in 1061, and throughout, right up until Henry VIII's destruction of the shrine in the 1530s. So for 450 years, it was the premier Marian shrine in the whole of Christendom. Well, I lived 30 miles from there, and I fell so in love with her and with the shrine and with the devotion I saw of the people to the Blessed Virgin there, that most weekends I didn't have a car, I didn't drive, but I would get on my bike, push bike, and would cycle the 30 miles, get there in time for noon mass, hang around for about 3 hours, just soaking up the atmosphere, and then cycle home again. And I did that for many months, most weekends, at least from Easter until when the weather got too cold. So, so I like many anti-Catholics, the Blessed Virgin and the Pope are the two big problems for me. Once you actually fall in love with the Blessed Virgin, there's no turning back.
That's consistent with how you've described each of those key players in your conversion. I mean, it's really just kind of a personal relationship, through Chesterton, certainly through Our Lady, through Father Yo. I mean, it was through C.S. Lewis. I mean, it was kind of relating to them as as another soul. How after your conversion, after feeling the grace of God and receiving the sacraments, how did you yourself live your reconciliation? Perhaps with those that were suffered from the sins of your past life. Did you find ways to reconcile or reach out or find some kind of connection with them?
Yeah, I sort of broke with that past, and I must confess that you don't know your enemy, right? The enemy is a faceless monster that you attack when you see them on the streets. It might be a real person you're kicking in the head. You don't know who they are. You're never going to find out who they are. So I live, if you like, with the ghost of the harm that I did, and I see my life since I was received into the church as an act of reparation for the damage that I did in those days, and I thank God for all that He's enabled me to do in the whatever it's 30 years now that I've been a Catholic, and please God, He'll give me several more years to continue making reparation for the harm that I've done. In other words, I hope that my purgatory is beginning this side of the grave.
Well, one of the one of the things that connects all people in communion with Christ is this, is His merciful grace and His forgiveness, and how it just washes away barriers and bonds. Did you, once you kind of broke through, how did that wash away from you? How did all of those, those dark forces, the shadows, how did you forget them? How did you just kind of clear your mind from them?
Well, G.K. Chesterton, when G.K. Chesterton was asked why he wanted to become a Catholic, he said, because I wanted my sins to be forgiven. In other words, the sacrament of penance. And I did feel, when I made my first confession on the day before my reception into the church back in 1989, I felt God's forgiveness. I believed in God's forgiveness, and I did believe that all of my sins had been forgiven, and there was a huge weight. I did feel, in some sense, I've been washed white in the blood, with the blood of the Lamb. Now, I still believe, of course, there's a price to pay for the damage I've done. As I've just said, that's why I'm making reparation. But I don't believe that Christ is holding those sins over my head, because they have been purged from me by His saving grace and mercy, which we get through the sacrament of confession. So I'm not carrying the guilt of the sin, but I am carrying the awareness of the damage I've done, and I have a debt to pay. And that's what I see the rest of my life as being.
Well, in your autobiography, you also talked about, the influence that Alexander Solzhenitsyn had on you, even before you fully appreciated it. And, when it was really from the perspective of your conversion and faith that you were motivated to reach out to, to the great Soviet dissident. Is this a good segue for us to then lead into to your biography of Solzhenitsyn?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, basically, there's two ways of approaching Solzhenitsyn: the objective and the subjective. In other words, who he was and how he impacted me. And I'm probably going to spend most time on the latter, just because of the lack of time. Normally, I would spend half the talk talking about who Solzhenitsyn was, his historical perspective. But you can all go and Google him if you want to find that out. But certainly when I was a teenager, so when I was in the midst of the whole neo-Nazi white supremacist thing, I was anti-communist, and I had a very long commute because I was working full-time for this radical organization, the National Front, and they were way out to the west of London, and I was living way to the east of London. I had a 2-hour commute each way every day, and I did an awful lot of reading. And one of the books I read on, and I didn't drive it. It was basically one bus and 3 trains each way every day. So I did lots of reading, and one of the books I read was the Gulag Archipelago, the first volume of which had just been published. And if any of you seen it, it's 3 volumes, but one volume is that thick, 700-800 pages or whatever. And I read that, and I was admired Solzhenitsyn's courage, what he'd been through. I mean, he was someone who stood up against the power of the Soviet Empire single-handedly, and by courage, faith, miracle, survived. So I was an admirer ever since then, but so he's always on my radar as sort of a hero of mine. But after I converted, if you like, he was sort of not really in my mind, and I was working at a book wholesaler's around the time of my conversion. And there was a new book published by Solzhenitsyn that caught my eye on the shelf called Rebuilding Russia. And I took this off the shelf and started reading it, and it was pure Catholic social teaching. It was subsidiarity, solidarity, Chestertonian distributism. And I thought, wow, this man is even better than I thought he was. Not only is he courageous and anti-communist, he has a vision for the rebuilding of Russia and the rebuilding of the West, which is rooted in a Catholic political philosophy. So this rekindled my my interest in him. I started rereading him. And then I had this wild idea of writing to him. No, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was back in Russia. I have no idea. He returned to Russia in 1994. This is about 1998. I had no idea where he lived. And I have no memory now of how I found out where he lived. But somehow I did, and I sent him a letter. And he was living outside Moscow. And I'm not expecting to get a reply, of course. But the best I was hoping for is he would reply and say, thanks, but no thanks, and sign it Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I've got the great man's autograph, right? And that's worth it. But to my astonishment, he writes back and says, yes, make arrangements to come to Russia to interview me. And here are the addresses of two of my sons who will act as translators and mediators to help you make the necessary arrangements. Now, Solzhenitsyn had not spoken to a Western journalist for years because of the way that the Western media had treated him following his Harvard address in 1978. So I'm thinking, why on earth would he give me an interview? Because at this time, I only had one book published, my Chesterton book, nothing else. And why would he give me an interview when he hasn't given all these much better known writers and newspapers an interview? And I thought, okay, well, what I wrote to him was, I didn't believe that any of the previous biographies of Solzhenitsyn had paid enough attention to the centrality of his Christian faith as the motivator for his actions. And in order to sort of give my CV, which all it was, apart from the unmentionable stuff in the past, was the fact I'd written a biography of Chesterton. So anyway, so I had no real idea why he should say yes to me on the basis of that short letter with those few details. Anyway, I took his letter down to my publisher in London, HarperCollins, and I waved Solzhenitsyn's letter in front of them and said, you have to give me a contract to write a biography of him, and you also have to give me an extra, I can't remember what I said now, £5,000 or something to pay for my trip to Moscow and expenses and whatever. And they looked at it, and they were as astonished as I was and said, no problem. So I went to Russia, and when I was taken to his house, before he appeared, his wife made a point of taking me to a different room, showed me the top shelf of a bookshelf, and it was the Ignatius Press collected works of G.K. Chesterton. So yeah, I realized that Chesterton had already, of course, done me, it brought me to the church almost single-handedly under grace. Obviously, God be the glory. But as an agent of grace, Chesterton, I owed him so much already. He was actually the password or the key to get me to Solzhenitsyn. So, and then another reason to thank him. So the interview again went extremely well. I almost messed up because I said to him, all the other biographies were much too political. And the first two questions I asked him were political questions. And he sort of stopped and looked at me and said, I thought this wasn't going to be a political interview. And I thought for a moment he's going to throw me out. And I got all the way to Moscow. I got so close. But anyway, things got better after that. And he liked my biography. So when we did because most of the people I write about are dead. When someone's dead, they're not a moving target, right? The final chapter is about them dying, simple. But when you're writing about someone who's still alive, obviously the story is still being told. Although Solzhenitsyn was 79 when I interviewed him, he lived for another 10 years and did a huge amount, actually, in those 10 years. So I wanted to do a revised biography of him, and he cooperated, and his family cooperated after he died. And so we brought a second edition out with about 4 or 5 new chapters. There's a postscript. I'm sure I'm leaving loads out here just because of the so much we need to be running out of time, basically. But that Solzhenitsyn, when he first went back to Russia, was treated with contempt. He said to me, because basically what happened after the pressure cooker's been on, right, for 70 years on the Soviet Union, this slavery. and under the Soviet yoke, under the communist yoke. It's removed. They want all they want is one hell of a party, which is what they have. And the mafia take over the economy, decadence pours in. And Solzhenitsyn said to me during my interview that people think I'm anti-Western. I'm not anti-Western. I see Russia as part of the West. That if the Iron Curtain had come down and all the cream of Western culture had seeped in over it, I would have rejoiced. He said, well, what happened was the Iron Curtain came up and all the dregs of Western decadence seeped in. And so because of that, he was not liked. He was not popular. He was the prophet at home. And yet, by around about the year 2000, actually around about the time Putin comes to power, all of a sudden, Solzhenitsyn becomes this Jeremiah type prophet who's listened to. You know, Russia's got all of its problems, so has the United States. We should look at the plank in our own eye before we put worry about other nations' splinters at this moment. But to call Russia a communist country, let me give one piece of evidence to prove that's not true. That the Russian government asked Solzhenitsyn's widow, after he died, to personally oversee the editing into a single volume of the Gulag Archipelago. So instead of 3 chunky volumes, it's 1 chunky volume. And she did that. She oversaw it, so it's not, no one is what he would want. And that is now compulsory part of the core curriculum in every Russian high school. I tell you what, this country would be much healthier if Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was required reading in every high school in the United States. So he's now seen as a giant in his homeland. And I think from his perspective, that probably means more than whatever we think about him in the West. But, thanks to there's a recent interest and growth in interest in Solzhenitsyn in the West as well. I've seen it in new editions of my biography and sales increasing. So I think with Solzhenitsyn, we end on an upbeat.
Well, one of the things about him, you mentioned the 1978 remarks he made, but the thing that prompted his return to Russia was his family was seeking U.S. citizenship, and he was in the process of seeking U.S. citizenship. And it was only when he was near the end, near the kind of taking the oath and signing the papers, that he took a look at the oath that he was going to have to sign, and it said that he would have to defend the Republic against all enemies, foreign or domestic, and he said, well, that might be Russia, and I cannot ever stand against the land where I was born. And as a matter of principle, then he chose not to accept U.S. citizenship, and that's really kind of what prompted that return. And that
I would say one thing, however, he was a great enemy of the Soviet Union because he distinguished between Russia, which is this nation, the Soviet Union, which was an evil empire, which wasn't just Russia. It was basically an empire that the Bolsheviks had gobbled up, going right down to large parts of Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and all those, and also, of course, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and then following World War II, the whole of the Eastern Bloc, the whole of Eastern Europe. So, he was very much in favor of a robust anti-Soviet policy. But it is a difference between the Soviet Union and Russia. He knew the difference. And even at the height of the Cold War, he said, before I die, I will go home. And because he believed that the Soviet Union would collapse. And really, in the 1970s, he would have been thought to be mad. Because if those are old enough to remember it, you thought that a Cold War scenario was nasty but stable, right? That basically the world is now sort of divided into 2 camps, right? The Soviet camp and the American NATO camp. And this was stable, and both sides have reached an impasse, and they were basically in a stalemate, and it's going to be like this for obviously not forever, nothing is, but for decades and decades and decades, we're all going to be dead before this changes, basically. So when Solzhenitsyn said, "I'm going to go home," in other words, after the Soviet Union falls, people looked at him as if he were mad. And this is a perfect example of when he's absolutely a prophet, because nobody else would have believed him, and he was proved correct.
Well, and he was also an equal opportunity critic. He was equally hard on the United States, even though the United States, stood in opposition to the communist Soviet Union, just as he was a critic, as you alluded to the way that Russia embraced, the bad qualities of the West.
I think the only thing I would say by way of nuance, I don't think he was anti-United States. In his Harvard address, he basically said that the West has become decadent, and that the post-Soviet Russia cannot look to the decadent West as a model. So I think it wasn't just the United States. It was basically what Western liberalism was doing to what remained of Christendom that he was opposing and critiquing in the Harvard address, not the United States per se. In fact, he had a lot of good things there at the United States. He loved the strength of the local democracy in the United States, for instance.
How did his faith sustain him through, the overwhelming pressures that were applied to him, particularly after his, great "Live Not by Lies" letter that he released, that was kind of a rallying cry for dissidents in the early '70s. I mean, how did his faith sustain him throughout that and provide kind of a consistency of, in his views about, about what should be social morality?
Well, first he did have a strong faith, and he had great fortitude, and he was willing to lay down his life and die for his faith. And he had a wife that was willing to stand by his side and die with him. Also a great help. Now, one of the most encouraging thing I find about Solzhenitsyn, actually, is that for those of us that have read 1984 by George Orwell, that Big Brother wins. Winston Smith may want freedom, but Big Brother's going to basically stick its jackboot on his head, and he won't even die heroically. He'll basically betray everyone, including himself, in accepting Big Brother. While Orwell was writing that novel, Solzhenitsyn was lying in a cell in a labor camp in the Soviet Union, determined that he was going to defeat Big Brother. Now, and again, that's madness, right? He's one of millions of prisoners, one of millions of people can be put to death, except he survives by the grace of God. And yet he emerges, and through One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, first of all, his first novel, and what that causes globally, and then the Gulag Archipelago and other works, helps to bring down, if you look at the major figures in bringing down the Soviet Union, it's St. John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. A little bit of help from Maggie Thatcher. So he's a giant. But the real thing about it, he represents the triumph of Winston Smith, the triumph of the little man in Orwell's Big Brother who's crushed. And in fiction, it's an unhappy ending. But one of the really encouraging things about Solzhenitsyn's life is that truth is stranger than fiction and has a much happier ending.
Did he see himself, kind of in that way? I mean, did he see that, he was, guided by the hand of Providence through this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. He saw the connection between suffering and redemption. In other words, the cross as being central. The major moments in his life, he says, were moments of conversion, all involved major suffering. So the first was his arrest. In my biography, I have a chapter called Arrested Development, right? Because the paradox, he had to be arrested in order to develop, because he was an atheist. He believed all the lies of the Soviet propaganda machine. But in being arrested for writing something critical of Joseph Stalin in a private letter to a friend during World War II, when he's serving in the Soviet army, he's sentenced to 7 years hard labor. He's tortured and sees the whole system for what it is. In other words, his eyes are opened. And for Solzhenitsyn, give me the cross, give me crucifixion if it's going to open my eyes, rather than living a lie. So there was the arrest, and then the experience of prison, and then the experience of cancer, which was thought to be terminal. And that precipitated his conversion to Christianity, from which he never looked back. So Solzhenitsyn sees this mystical connection between spiritual progress and the power of the cross. And so therefore, of course, he's not going to shy away or flinch from suffering, because he sees that as being not just necessary, but edifying, but actually a blessing.
Well, and his just profound moral voice in speaking out against the decadence of the West, as well as the dehumanization of communism, always kind of spoke to the little things too. I mean, if going back to his letter "Live Not by Lies," I mean, his challenge to his peers in standing up, standing up as a Winston Smith against the system. He pointed explicitly to small things. That if you allow yourself to compromise those small things, then you are becoming part of the herd. You are accepting the system as it is. And it really seemed like he was saying that, if you compromise on those small things, you're giving up, the larger piece of your soul.
Yeah, basically, it's the path of least resistance that leads to hell, right? Or the path of comfort that leads to hell. That you allow the little compromises with evil, because what harm can it do? And then you get in the habit of compromising, and then before you know it, you're just a compromiser. Which and Solzhenitsyn, somebody who calls a spade, would say, well, if you're a compromiser, you're a liar, because you're not actually standing up for the truth that you say you believe in, because you've compromised your soul so much, you are actually doing the work of the devil. You're part of the devil's herd.
Well, what do you think that he would say if he were to look at the culture in the West today, where there seems to be such a growing antipathy toward faith? There seems to be kind of redefinition of tried and true concepts, around around gender, for instance. How would he respond to that? What would he call on people of faith to do? What would he ask today's Winstons to do in response to what seems to be kind of a maybe a growing cultural totalitarianism, for lack of a better word?
Well, I think that basically he answered that right at the end of our interview. I said, that are you pessimistic about the future? And he said, he smiled. By the way, I should say about Solzhenitsyn, he was 79 years old, and he had beautiful china blue eyes, and he held my gaze once, and on the surface he was like a teenager. The eyes were alive and vibrant. He held his gaze, you could see depth of suffering and wisdom. Now, whether that's my subjective projection or whether it was really there, but that was the experience. But he did have this glint in his eye, and this very infectious chuckle. And his family, by the way, say that he's a great mimic and has them rolling on the floor mimicking politicians. So he's not just the Jeremiah figure we think he is, right? There's more to him. But he has this infectious chuckle, which I experienced that today. He says, people say I'm a pessimist. He says, but I'm not really a pessimist. He says, I'm a pessimistic optimist. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, basically that God's in charge, God's in heaven, and however much we try to foul things up, there's only one ending, and it's not a sad one. And I think that's rooted in a deep, profound Christian philosophy of seeing God's omnipresence. Now, I have always thought about God's omnipresence as God's present everywhere. So he's on my head, under the table, up on the roof, right? God's present everywhere. And that's true. But in a much deeper sense, is everything is present to God. right? So there is no future for God and there is no past for God. The whole of time is present to him. So he can't say God knew or God will know. God knows, right? And we know how it's going to end because it's been revealed to us. So if you can see history, if you like, through those divine eyes and understand it's all in God's presence, then it doesn't matter how dark the particular days you live in are. And basically, the more you understand history, just about everybody lives in dark days. I'm writing a history of England at the moment. I'm in Queen Elizabeth the First reign, where it was punishment by death and excruciatingly slow and torturous death just to be a priest or just to harbour a priest, to hide a priest in your home. I mean, things are bad in England and not that bad at the moment, right? So, so things aren't as the worst they've ever been and getting worse. No, they stink because basically this is human society. We are a fallen, broken people. We are worship the god of pride rather than the God himself. More, in other words, we worship ourselves more than we worship God, and we trample on our neighbor because we don't worship God. That's the pattern of history, right? But throughout it all, we have the witness of the saints. We have, and the saints aren't just those that are canonized. They're all those people that have lived heroically in spite of the suffering that this world confronts them with. And that's the church triumphant. And that's the largest part of the church, and it's the church that's beyond time, in God's presence, in the fullness. And that's all we have to do. The only history that we have is 70 years and 10. And when you get to my age, I've already got my eye on the finishing line. I don't have to worry about what's going to be happening 100 years from now, except to know that it's present to God now. And all I have to do is cross that finishing line so I can be present with him in that deeper sense. And Solzhenitsyn got that. Solzhenitsyn understood that. That's why he was a pessimistic optimist, right? He could see that basically it's always going to be a mess. That's the pessimism. But that's transcended and superseded by an optimism that ultimately the world is charged with the grandeur of God and God is present.
Well, what do Catholics have to do today to touch that kind of optimism that was captured in the twinkle of Solzhenitsyn's eye? I mean, we're all called to evangelize. You are a great evangelist through your work and through your talks. But what do Catholics every day have to do, given the things that are pulling at us in the culture, and the things that we need to do to hold our families, our community together, in celebration of our faith in Christ?
Well, the most important thing is to celebrate our faith in Christ. In other words, that we should be full of the joy of God's presence, especially his Eucharistic presence. We should have a very deep and daily and habitual prayer life, because it's that sustains us. That's where we get our nourishment and our spiritual nutrition. Without that, we can do nothing. In other words, without the grace of God, we are lost. So we have to remain in the grace of God. And if we do that, then we can actually move mountains. And if that's not just metaphorical, well, it might be ultimately, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn did move a mountain, right? One man was a major figure in the bringing down of probably the most barbaric and murderous tyranny and empire in the whole of human history. All right, and that's because he lived in God's presence, lived in that grace, and had the courage that came from that, the courage that the saints have. And so, and we do have to realize we mustn't believe the lie of progressivism that basically that you've got to be on the right side of history, because history is this machine again, right? And it's all got to work itself out. There's a golden age in the future which we're moving to, because secularism, which is what that is, what's its track record? The French Revolution, the guillotine, the Russian Revolution, the Gulag, the Nazi Revolution, the gas chamber. According to the three G's: guillotine, Gulag, gas chamber. Right, hundreds of millions of people killed in pursuit of their golden age in the future. And that's what they can carry on repeating that. And ultimately, we don't have to defeat evil, right? We just have to stay true to the good. Evil always defeats itself. So the saying that pride precedes a fall is true. We don't have to destroy them; they destroy each other, right? Look at the Soviet Union and the Nazis, right? Destroying each other on the Eastern Front. That's what happens. The only danger is, and it's one that we should welcome if we have courage, if you give the devil enough rope, he hangs himself. But if you give him enough power, he hangs us first.
Well, Joseph, I can't thank you enough for your time. If knowing that we're going to be back together in 3 weeks, is there anything finally that you would encourage people to look for as they dive into these books or into these ideas around these books?
Well, I would only say that when I give talks around the country, and that hasn't happened much lately, that sometimes the most exciting part of the evening is the Q&A. We're going to have a dynamic Q&A session. We're going to have great fun in 3 weeks from now, but that obviously requires people not just reading, the books, but thinking about questions, maybe even writing some questions down. And if everybody comes with a question or two, we're going to have a great time.
Well, I can't thank you again. Really appreciate it, Joseph. Again, my name is Frank Dirks, Carolina Catholic Professionals. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We've recorded this evening's discussion, and we will have that link to our website. And again, Joseph Pearce, thank you so very much for all you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening. God bless.
All right. Have a great night. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
And thank you all for joining.